I remember the cold of the wooden floor more than the sting of the belt. The belt came later. What I remember first is the silence before the screaming, before the burning ache in my back and arms, just silence. And in that silence, my mother sat at the table, sipping her coffee as if nothing was wrong. She looked up when I fell. She even smiled. My name is Sandra Berry. I'm 81 years old. I live alone now in a modest yellow house on the outskirts of Fort Collins, Colorado. The roses in my garden bloom brighter each spring, and the robins return like clockwork to sing at my windowsill. From the outside, my life looks peaceful, simple, even idyllic. People often say to me, "You must have had a beautiful life, Miss Berry." And I nod politely. But the truth is, they have no idea what I survived to be standing here today. Some stories begin with love. Mine begins with fear. Growing up in Fort Collins in the late 1940s, we lived in a plain 2-story house with chipping paint and a small porch out front. It sat at the end of a gravel road that turned muddy every spring. My father, Walter Berry, built it with his own hands before I was born. He was proud of it, proud of everything, really his work, his discipline, his silence. He didn't laugh, not even at Sunday potlucks. He spoke with his eyes, not his mouth, and when he did speak, his voice always carried warning. My mother, Dolores, was a different kind of cold, the type that seeps into your bones and stays there long after the fire dies out. She wasn't cruel in the way he was. She never hit me, never raised her voice, but she didn't stop him either. She didn't shield me, and sometimes I swear she enjoyed watching me suffer. I was their only child, no brothers or sisters to distract the storm, just me. I suppose people like to believe that pain always has a clear beginning, that there's a moment when it all changes. But for me, the fear was there before I even knew what to call it. I felt it in the way my father's footsteps echoed through the hallway, in the way my mother's eyes flicked across the dinner table like a blade, in the way silence could stretch so long it felt like punishment in itself. The first time my father hit me, I was 6. I had dropped my plate of food, mashed potatoes and green beans, and the dish shattered on the floor. I cried, not from pain, but from fear of what I knew was coming. He didn't say a word, just reached for his belt, unbuckled it slowly, and pulled me into the kitchen corner. I remember the sound of the leather cutting through the air, and the heat, and how I bit my lip until I tasted blood because I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of hearing me scream. When it was over, I turned to look for my mother. She was still sitting at the table, still drinking her coffee. And when our eyes met, I saw it just for a second, that curl of her lips, that awful little smirk. That moment marked the beginning of my silence. I stopped crying, stopped hoping. I stopped asking her to protect me, because I knew now she never would. The years blurred after that. School was a refuge, though I never told anyone the truth. Who would have believed me? Walter Berry was a churchman, a working man, respected by neighbors. Dolores was a quiet wife, always in a clean dress with combed hair. I was the quiet girl with long braids and bruises she never explained. Sometimes I dreamed of running away. I'd imagine a life where anyone would see me, really see me. But dreams like that were dangerous. They gave me hope. And hope, in that house, was the quickest way to get hurt. It's been decades since those days. I've outlived both of them. Outlived the pain, too mostly, but I never forgot it. I couldn't, because pain like that, it shapes you. It steals your voice, your sleep, your sense of safety. And still, somehow, I found a way to survive. I'm telling this story now because I believe someone needs to hear it. Not to pity me, no. I don't want that. I want you to know that even when you're raised in darkness, even when the people who were supposed to love you hurt you the most, you can still find your way into the light. But that journey isn't simple, and it doesn't happen all at once. Mine began the day I saw my mother smile while my father beat me, and I realized I was utterly alone, but it wouldn't always be that way. Not forever. When I think back to those early years, before the bruises darkened and the silence hardened, there were small moments that hinted at what was coming, like cracks in the sidewalk before the earth splits open. Our house on Ashwood Lane was ordinary in every way, a modest 2-story with thin walls, a sagging porch swing, and faded curtains that never seemed to let enough light in. From the outside, no one could have guessed what happened once the front door closed. My father, Walter, was a man of routine. He woke every morning at 5:30, shaved without water, and left the house with his lunch pail precisely at 6. He was a foreman for a local construction crew, a job he took pride in. A man builds with his hands and rules with his voice. He once said to me after I asked why he never smiled, he didn't believe in play or laughter or, for that matter, conversation that wasn't about obedience, order, or consequence. To him, a child was meant to be seen, not heard. And if a child dared cross that boundary well, the punishment was swift and always physical. But what truly shaped me wasn't just my father's fists or belt. It was my mother's eyes. Dolores Berry was as elegant as she was cold. She ironed every blouse until it was crisp enough to cut. Her lipstick was always perfect, and her silence more cutting than any words could have been. She had a way of making you feel ashamed, even when you hadn't done anything wrong. If I dropped a fork at dinner, she would pause, blink slowly, and sigh just loud enough for it to sting. If I giggled too loudly at the neighbor's dog chasing its tail, she'd glance my way like I had embarrassed her in front of 1,000 people. I spent my days trying to decode her expressions, hoping for approval, terrified of disappointment. But she never hit me, not once. And for years, I thought that meant she loved me in some twisted, invisible way. By the time I was 7, I had already learned to walk on eggshells. I folded my clothes neatly, never spoke unless spoken to, and made sure my homework was perfect. But even perfection couldn't protect me. I remember one winter evening, I must have been 8 when I left a pair of wet socks on the bathroom floor. Just socks. Nothing more. But when my father came home and Dolores pointed to them without a word, he dragged me by the arm into the kitchen and made me kneel on rice. I knelt there for over an hour while dinner cooked, the dry grains biting into my knees while my mother stirred her stew and hummed a hymn. It was the humming that stayed with me. How do you reconcile that kind of cruelty from the very people who gave you life? There were small mercies in those early years, fleeting bits of light that kept me from slipping too far into despair. My second-grade teacher, Miss Carol Hughes, was one of them. She had a soft voice and a laugh like wind chimes. She kept extra pencils in her desk drawer and let me sit by the window during story time. Sometimes, she'd place her hand gently on my shoulder and ask, "How are things at home?" "Sweetheart," I always said fine, because what else could I say? That my father punished silence as harshly as he punished noise. That my mother measured my worth by how still I could sit and how quiet I could cry. Still, Miss Hughes looked at me in a way no one else did, like she saw me, like she knew. It was around that time I began writing in secret. I kept a notebook hidden under the floorboard of my closet. In it, I wrote the kind of mother I wished I had, one who laughed, one who told bedtime stories, one who didn't flinch when you reached for her hand. I wrote about a father who knelt beside you when you fell, instead of raising his belt. It was fantasy, of course, but it was mine. And in those pages, I wasn't alone. My friendships at school were thin, like soap bubbles. No one came over. I was never allowed to attend birthday parties. If I tried to invite someone home, Dolores would say, "This house is not for entertaining." So I stopped trying. I became the quiet girl, the one teachers praised for being so well behaved. They had no idea that I didn't act out because I knew exactly what would happen if I did. I followed every rule, sat at the front of the class, and kept my eyes low because my life depended on it. At church, people complimented my manners. "You've raised her right," they'd say to Dolores with warm smiles and approving nods. She would return their smiles with grace and hold my hand too tightly as we walked back to the car. On Sundays, we looked like a picture-perfect family. Walter in his gray suit, Dolores in a blue dress with pearls, and me quiet, polished, hollow inside. No one knew that sometimes. After those very church services, my father would punish me for imaginary slights, a laugh that lingered too long, a word said too loud, a skirt not ironed just right. And no one knew that Dolores would hand him the belt herself. Still, at that age, I hadn't given up on them. I hadn't yet learned how deep the rot went. I still believed, somewhere inside, that if I was good enough, quiet enough, obedient enough, they'd change. That maybe, just maybe, they'd love me back. But love doesn't hide behind fear, and I would learn that lesson the hard way. I was 9 years old the first time he drew blood. It happened over a glass of milk. I'd accidentally knocked it over at breakfast, just a light tap of the elbow, one of those harmless childhood mistakes. But in our house, there was no such thing as harmless. The milk spread across the table like a flood, soaking into my school papers. My heart stopped. I froze, hoping, praying maybe he hadn't seen it. But Walter Berry saw everything. His hand gripped the edge of the table so hard I thought the wood might splinter. Dolores looked up from her teacup with that familiar quiet smirk curling at the corners of her mouth. She didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply dabbed the corner of her mouth with a napkin and said, "She's getting careless." That was all it took. He stood up slowly, always slowly, as if the slowness made it worse, and unbuckled his belt. The metallic click of that buckle haunts me to this day. I tried to apologize, tried to explain, but the words got caught in my throat. He didn't want an explanation. He wanted control. He wanted silence. And I gave it to him, through clenched teeth and quiet sobs. That morning, he whipped me so hard I bled through my school dress. Dolores didn't offer a towel. She didn't offer an ounce of comfort. She simply told me to go change and not be late for the bus. I walked to school with my back burning, every step a reminder of my failure to exist without error. It never stopped at one incident. The older I got, the more Walter's anger grew. Or maybe it wasn't anger. It was something colder, something deliberate. He began finding new ways to hurt. He'd make me kneel on uncooked rice for hours, arms raised above my head, until my knees felt like they were filled with glass, and my arms trembled so violently I could barely lift a pencil the next day. When I was 10, He locked me in the cellar overnight for humming while washing dishes. The air down there smelled of damp wood and old potatoes. I sat in the corner, knees pulled to my chest, listening to the house creak above me. I knew they were both up there, eating dinner, laughing, maybe, living. Dolores had passed me on her way to the kitchen before he shoved me down the cellar stairs. I caught her eye, hoping, begging for intervention. But all she said was, "You brought this on yourself." I sometimes wondered if she had ever been like me once, if she'd ever been a child who longed for affection, for warmth, but whatever softness had once lived in her was long gone. Maybe Walter had beaten it out of her too, or maybe she had buried it herself, wrapped it in lace and decency, and decided that cruelty was cleaner than vulnerability. By the time I reached 11, the punishments became rituals. Sundays were the worst. I had to stand perfectly still as Dolores ironed my dress, pressing the pleats so sharply they could cut. My hair had to be braided tightly, my shoes polished. Church was their stage, and I was the quiet little doll who played her part. But Sundays were also when Walter drank. He would sip bourbon from a flask he kept in the garage, and by the time we returned from service, his voice grew louder, his hands less controlled. One Sunday afternoon, I forgot to fold the hymnal and left it on the kitchen table. That night, he dragged me into the bathroom and shoved my head into the tub, turning on the cold water full blast. He held me there until my lungs screamed. When he finally let go, I fell to the floor coughing, gasping for air, eyes red, ears ringing. Dolores stood in the hallway watching. Her arms were crossed, and she said, almost bored, "Don't drown her. Walter, you'll have to clean it up." That was when something inside me cracked. Not broke completely. No, that would come later, but cracked in a way that changed how I saw the world. I stopped seeing myself as a daughter. I wasn't a child anymore. Not really. I was a prisoner in a home decorated with crosses and family portraits. At school, I became a ghost. I drifted through the halls, kept my eyes down, never spoke unless called on. Miss Hughes continued to give me soft smiles and gentle questions, but I kept my secrets close. I didn't trust anyone. Not after what happened last time I tried to speak out, because I had tried once. One day after class, I stayed behind and whispered to Miss Hughes that things weren't okay at home. She asked me to explain, and I told her about the cellar, about the bruises on my legs. She looked horrified but calm. "You did the right thing, sweetheart," she said. "I'm going to make sure someone talks to your parents." That night, 2 men in suits came to our door. Dolores invited them in with a smile as sweet as her lemon pie. Walter shook their hands firmly. They all sat in the living room while I stayed upstairs. Heart pounding. I heard muffled voices, Dolores's laugh, the sound of coffee cups clinking. When they left, Walter came upstairs without a word, and then he made me regret opening my mouth. I don't remember much of that night, just the feel of the belt, the pain in my ribs, the wetness of blood, and Dolores's voice outside the door saying softly, "You always make things harder for yourself." The next morning, I limped to school in silence. Miss Hughes didn't ask again. No one ever did. By the time I turned 12, I stopped hoping for rescue. I believed, truly believed, that I was invisible to the world, that no one would ever help me, that I had been born into this life for a reason, and that reason was to suffer. I hadn't yet found the courage to question that belief, let alone fight it. But a storm was coming, a deeper, darker phase of violence that would change everything I thought I knew about my family and myself. And the first strike of that storm would fall on a night I'll never forget. It was late October when I finally broke. The air in Fort Collins had already turned sharp with cold, and the cottonwoods behind our house had dropped most of their leaves. I remember watching them fall from my bedroom window, drifting like brittle little things that never stood a chance against the wind. That was how I felt. Dry, fragile, already halfway to the ground. That week, my father had grown more volatile than usual. I wasn't sure if it was the stress of work or just something that had been building inside him. He didn't need a reason. He never did. The smallest thing, a shoe left askew, a sneeze at the wrong time could bring the storm. This time, it was because I had forgotten to sweep the back porch. He came in from work, his boots stomping across the kitchen like thunder. Dolores was already setting the table for dinner. I was in my room, trying to finish my homework before the light faded. I didn't even hear him coming until the door slammed open behind me. Without a word, he grabbed me by the collar and yanked me out of the chair. I stumbled into the hallway, arms flailing, the air knocked out of me. He dragged me out to the porch, pointed at a small pile of wind-blown leaves near the steps, and then, without a word, struck me across the face with the back of his hand. I saw stars. The world spun. My knees buckled, and I hit the floorboards hard. Blood dripped from my nose. I remember the chill of the wood against my cheek, the taste of iron in my mouth, and Dolores standing in the doorway. She didn't gasp. She didn't run to me. She simply crossed her arms and said, "You see what happens when you let things slide." And then she closed the door. That was the night I decided to run. I waited until the house was silent, until I was sure they were asleep. I packed a small satchel with a change of clothes, a slice of bread wrapped in wax paper, and my notebook from under the floorboard. I slipped out the back door and walked. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. The streetlights flickered as I passed. My breath came out in white clouds. I kept walking, past the railroad tracks, past the diner where Dolores sometimes bought coffee, past the library where I'd spent long afternoons pretending to read while hiding from home. And then, almost without thinking, my feet took me to the place I had always felt safest, Miss Hughes's house. It was a small bungalow with a white picket fence and rose bushes out front, already wilted from frost. I crept up the steps and knocked softly at first, then harder, until the porch light came on and the door creaked open. She gasped when she saw me. Sandra, I must have looked like a ghost. Blood on my shirt, one eye swelling shut, dirt on my hands. I couldn't even speak. I just stood there, shaking. She pulled me inside, wrapped me in a blanket, and sat me by the fire. I remember her kneeling in front of me, tears in her eyes, brushing hair out of my face. "Sweetheart, what did they do to you that night?" For the first time in my life, I told the truth, all of it, about the beatings, the ice-cold silences, the rice, the bathtub, my mother's smirk, my father's fists. Miss Hughes listened, held my hand, and promised she would do something. "You're safe now," she whispered. "I won't let them hurt you again." I believed her. The next morning, she took me to the county welfare office. I sat with a social worker named Mr. Wallace Tall, kind eyes, gray suit, and told my story again. He nodded, took notes, and asked questions so gently that I almost cried. "We're going to investigate this, Sandra," he said, "but we need to follow procedure. I want you to stay here with Miss Hughes while we visit your parents." The words sent a chill through me. I didn't want to go back, not even for a minute, But Miss Hughes reassured me. This is how things work. They need to verify. Then we'll keep you safe. That afternoon, they knocked on the front door of my house. Dolores answered. Of course, Walter was home early from work, somehow expecting the visit. I don't know what they said or how they said it. All I know is that 2 hours later, a car pulled up in front of Miss Hughes's house, and Mr. Wallace walked up the path with a tight expression on his face. They've denied everything, he said. Your mother said you're troubled, that you have episodes, that you self-harm for attention. I felt the blood drain from my face. She showed us school reports with high grades, said there were no medical records of injury, said your father is respected in the community. I wanted to scream, to beg, but I couldn't move. Miss Hughes protested. You've seen the bruises. They claimed she fell. He cut in, quietly, and without proof. The law can't intervene. They made me go home. I'll never forget the ride back. Every mile felt like a death sentence. Miss Hughes squeezed my hand the whole way, whispering, Don't give up. I'll keep trying. When we pulled into the driveway, Dolores was standing on the porch in her apron, smiling. Walter opened the front door. That night was worse than any that came before. He didn't just hit me. He broke something inside me. I remember crawling back to my room, every breath a knife. I curled up on the floor, not even bothering with the bed. My notebook had been burned. I'd find the ashes in the fireplace the next day. And Dolores, she stood in the hallway the whole time, watched, smiled. I didn't speak for 2 weeks after that night. Not at school, not at dinner, not even when Dolores snapped her fingers and told me to answer. I couldn't. My voice had retreated somewhere so deep I could no longer reach it. Something in me had gone quiet, not from fear this time, but from something worse. Emptiness. I had learned the most brutal truth of all that sometimes, even when you scream for help. No one comes, and if they do, they're too late, or too bound by rules, or too afraid to look deeper. What's more, my own mother had sealed the door shut behind me. I was 13 now, and I stopped trying to escape. Instead, I learned how to survive. I kept a toothbrush and comb in my school bag because Walter sometimes destroyed things in my room during his rages. I taught myself how to breathe shallow when the bruises were on my ribs. I learned how to keep my schoolwork flawless because a single B- could earn me a beating. And I stopped crying completely. Crying only made them angrier. Dolores took to calling me the girl more often than by name. It was like she had erased the idea that I was her daughter. She still cooked meals and pressed my clothes and polished the silver on Sundays, but never spoke to me unless it was to correct me, and Walter. He became more creative. It wasn't always beatings. Sometimes it was silence for days, no meals, no acknowledgement. Other times it was forcing me to stand with my arms above my head for hours, or dragging me out of bed in the night to scrub the kitchen floor with bleach until my fingers cracked. I once fell asleep at the dinner table and was forced to sleep in the barn for a week. That winter, I caught pneumonia. I lay in bed for 3 days with a fever so high I hallucinated. Dolores brought me broth and a damp cloth, but never called a doctor. I remember muttering nonsense, crying for my dead grandmother, and feeling her cold hand press against my forehead. Don't be dramatic, she whispered. You're too old to act like a baby. I survived. Barely. School remained my only thin thread of light. Miss Hughes was still there, still watching. She never stopped trying slipping extra lunch into my bag, praising my essays, holding my hand a second too long during spelling bees. but she was cautious now. The school had warned her not to interfere after that incident, so she helped in small, quiet ways. Still, I kept my distance. I couldn't trust anyone fully. I'd learned what happened when I did. At 14, I entered high school. The building was bigger, the students louder, the world slightly more open, but I felt even more alone. I walked the halls like a ghost in a pressed dress. I didn't laugh. I didn't flirt. I didn't join clubs or go to dances. I had nothing to give. I was busy surviving. One teacher, Mr. Dorsey, tried to reach me. He was young, idealistic, and noticed how I flinched when someone raised their voice. He once asked if things were all right at home. I lied. I told him my parents were strict, that's all, that they loved me but had high expectations, that I was fine. Because even if I told him the truth, I knew what would happen. I knew Dolores would bake a pie. Walter would put on his nicest shirt, and the school board would call me unstable again. No one would see the truth. They never did. I excelled academically, straight A's, perfect attendance. It became my armor. The more I succeeded at school, the more frustrated Walter became. I think deep down, he hated that I had something he couldn't control my mind. So he tried to tear it down. He called me stupid, accused me of cheating. Once, after I won a county essay contest, he ripped the certificate in two and said, "You think you're better than us now." But I clung to that essay. I'd written it about a bird trapped in a cage that one day remembered how to fly. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. The physical abuse ebbed and flowed. Some weeks, he ignored me completely. Other weeks, he exploded at the smallest provocation. Dolores remained the ever-watchful sentinel, her face unreadable, her hands always busy with something else dusting, folding, slicing apples. She had perfected the art of pretending not to hear me scream. At 15, I started spending more time in the library. I told Walter I needed it for homework, and somehow he believed me. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe he thought I wouldn't dare run again. And he was right. I wouldn't. Not yet. But in the silence of the library stacks, I read about women who escaped impossible lives. I read about justice, about psychology, about healing. I started writing again quietly, carefully, in a notebook I hid inside the lining of my coat. I wrote poems about invisible girls and mothers made of snow. I wrote down every word I wished I could say out loud. And in those pages, I began to come back to life. The violence never really stopped, but I was growing taller, stronger, smarter. I learned how to read the warning signs in Walter's posture, how to maneuver Dolores's moods, how to disappear when danger stirred in the house. My body remained a battlefield, but my mind was building something. I didn't know it then, but I was slowly carving a path toward escape, not through the back door, but through education, through knowledge, through sheer determination to make something of myself, not for revenge, not even for justice, but because I knew, deep down, that I was meant for more than pain. By 16, I had my eyes set on something unimaginable in our family college. And when I told Walter and Dolores, their reactions told me everything I already knew. Walter laughed an ugly, humorless bark. "You college, who do you think you are?" Dolores didn't even look up from her sewing. "Why waste money on a girl?" she muttered. "She'll just end up pregnant and back here anyway." But I said nothing. I only nodded, as I always had. And then I went back to my room and filled out every scholarship application I could find. Because no matter how many times they beat me down, I wasn't going to stay. Not forever. When I received the scholarship letter, I didn't cry. I just sat there, staring at the envelope in my lap, reading the words over and over again like they might disappear if I blinked. Congratulations. You've been awarded the Fort Collins Women's Academic Foundation Scholarship in full. It wasn't just a letter, it was a key, a door creaking open into a world where Walter Berry's belt could never follow, where Dolores's silence had no weight. I was 17. It wasn't a large university, just a modest liberal arts college up in Boulder, 3 hours away from Fort Collins. But to me, it might as well have been a continent away, a whole new life. I could already feel it, the taste of fresh air, unfiltered by fear, the possibility of mornings that didn't begin with clenched fists or held breath. I didn't tell them right away. For a week, I kept the letter tucked behind my dresser, under a loose floorboard. Each night, I pulled it out by candlelight and reread it until the words soaked into my skin like salvation. When I finally told them, because I had to, they reacted just as I expected. Walter laughed. Who's going to pay for that? You think scholarships feed you, clothe you. You'll come crawling back the moment they realize what you really are. Dolores didn't speak at all. She just shook her head, like I was a disappointment she didn't even have the energy to be angry with. But for the first time in my life, I didn't care what they thought, because I wasn't asking for permission. I was leaving. The summer before I left was hell. Walter made it his mission to remind me I was still under his roof, every chore doubled, every mistake punished. The belt came out more times than I could count. Dolores became colder, more distant. She didn't say a word to me for nearly a month. I think she hated that I was doing something she never had the courage to dream of. I worked odd jobs that summer, sweeping at the church, babysitting, sorting books at the library, anything to buy a second-hand suitcase, and a few clothes that weren't stitched by Dolores's hand. I saved every penny. My hands were raw, my feet blistered, but I didn't complain, because every blister brought me closer to freedom. When the day came to leave, I packed before sunrise. I didn't wait for breakfast, didn't wait for goodbyes. Walter was still in bed. Dolores stood in the kitchen, sipping coffee in her nightgown. I walked past her without a word, but just as I opened the door, I heard her voice. You'll be back. They always come back. I paused, not to respond, just to remember. I wanted that moment etched into my mind forever, her voice, her face, her bitter certainty, because I knew, deep in my bones, that I would never return to that house as a child again. The bus ride to Boulder felt like shedding a second skin. I watched the fields roll by, the mountains rise up like protectors in the distance. For the first time in years, I let the tension ease from my shoulders. My hands shook, not from fear, but from release. College was everything I had hoped for and nothing I had expected. I was terrified that first week. I didn't know how to make friends. I didn't know how to exist without looking over my shoulder. I still flinched when someone closed a door too hard. Still woke up in the night soaked in sweat, convinced Walter was standing at the foot of my bed. But I was free, and in that freedom, I began to rebuild. It was in my introduction to psychology class that I met Professor Alan Whitaker. He was in his 60s, tall with silver hair and kind eyes behind round glasses. On the third day of class, he pulled me aside after everyone left. He had noticed my writing, how I described trauma, repression, fear in a way that felt too personal to be theoretical. He asked if I'd ever spoken to anyone about my past. I froze. He didn't push. He just said, You don't have to carry it alone. Miss Barry, those words stuck to me like balm on an old wound. So I began attending office hours. At first, we discussed papers and theories. Then slowly, carefully, I told him pieces of my truth, not all at once, not even in order, just fragments, memories, a scar on my leg, a nightmare I couldn't shake. He listened, without judgment, without pity. You survived hell, he told me once. Now let's teach you how to live beyond it. And we did. With his help, I found a counselor at the student clinic. I joined a campus support group for women from abusive homes. For the first time in my life, I said out loud, my father beat me. My mother let him. I didn't deserve it. Each time I spoke those words, a weight lifted. I wasn't healed. Not yet. Not even close. But I was walking the path, and I was doing it on my own terms. I majored in psychology, not because I wanted to study pain, but because I wanted to understand how to break the cycle. I wanted to be the person I never had, growing up the one who listens, who believes, who says, you're not crazy, and it wasn't your fault. By the time I graduated, I had something far greater than a degree. I had reclaimed myself. Starting over wasn't as cinematic as people like to imagine. There were no triumphant violins, no dramatic sunsets. Just quiet mornings and slow steps, one after the other. After graduation, I stayed in Boulder for a while, working as a research assistant at the university. I shared a small apartment with 2 other women, both bright and driven, but unaware of the war I had come from. I didn't talk much about my past, not because I was ashamed, but because it still lived inside me like a sleeping animal. I was afraid that if I stirred it too much, it would wake and pull me back under. But my work gave me purpose. I focused on trauma psychology, particularly in women. I volunteered at local shelters, helping survivors write resumes, fill out court forms, or just sit with a warm cup of tea and breathe. It healed me more than any textbook ever could. That's where I met George Manning. He wasn't flashy. He didn't come with flowers or grand gestures. He walked into the shelter one Friday morning, holding a crate of supplies blankets, canned food, first aid kits, and asked if anyone could help him unload. I offered, quietly, out of habit more than interest. We talked a little that day. He was a veterinarian, recently moved to Boulder from Colorado Springs after losing his wife to cancer 2 years earlier. There was a calmness about him that I didn't understand at first. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of peace. A man who had been through fire, but hadn't let it turn him to ash. He came back the next week, then again. Weeks turned into months. He'd bring warm coffee, sometimes with 2 sugars just the way I liked, even though I'd never told him. He'd ask about my day, but never pry. He never flinched when I froze during certain conversations, never pushed when I turned away. One rainy evening, we sat together on the shelter porch, watching the cars splash through puddles. He looked over at me and said, "You always sit like you're ready to run." I didn't answer. After a long pause, he added, "You don't have to. Not from me." That was the moment I realized I wasn't afraid of him, that I could trust this man who asked nothing, offered everything, and never once tried to fix me. We married 3 years later. I was in my early 40s. For some, that's late. For me, it was right on time. We bought a modest home in a quiet neighborhood in Boulder. The backyard had enough room for his garden and my writing shed. We adopted a dog from his clinic, a mutt named Penny, with a crooked tail and the gentlest eyes. When I got pregnant, I was terrified. terrified I wouldn't know how to love, that I'd repeat what Dolores did, that some broken thing inside me would spill over onto the life growing inside me. But George held me through every fear, every tear, every trembling night. And when our daughter Elise was born, something changed in me I hadn't known was still possible. The first time I held her, I cried not out of fear, but out of awe. I made a silent vow in that hospital room. You will never wonder if you are loved. Raising Elise was not always easy. I had to fight old instincts, the way I'd flinch at loud cries, the way I'd freeze during her tantrums, the way I second-guessed every decision. But I learned. I read books. I asked for help. I told her I loved her every single day, sometimes just to remind myself that I could. George was a patient father, gentle and wise. Elise adored him. Watching them together filled something in me that had been hollow for too long. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit by Elise's bed while she slept, her tiny fingers curled into fists, and whisper, "You're safe." I think I was saying it to both of us. Over the years, the nightmares faded. Not completely, but enough. Enough that I could sleep through most nights. Enough that I no longer jumped at footsteps behind me. Enough that I could look in the mirror and see a woman, not a wound. George passed away when Elise was 16, a sudden heart attack. One moment he was trimming his tomato plants. The next, he was gone. It shattered us. But this time, I didn't go numb. I let myself grieve, let Elise see me cry, and we held each other through it. Because I had learned love doesn't mean you'll never lose. It just means you won't face the loss alone. And this time, I wasn't alone. It had been decades since I last spoke to either of them. After I left Fort Collins, I never looked back, not once. I didn't send letters. I didn't return for holidays. I changed my phone number, moved addresses, closed every door that might lead them back to me. And for a while, that was enough. But grief has a strange way of cracking open old walls. After George died, the silence in our house grew heavy. Elise was quiet in her mourning, keeping close to me but asking questions I wasn't ready for, questions about my past, about why she'd never met her grandparents, about where I had come from. I gave her pieces, small, manageable truths, that I had a difficult childhood, that my parents weren't kind, that they hurt me. But I didn't go deeper, not until the letter came. It arrived in a plain envelope, no return address, just my name, written in the rigid, controlled handwriting I remembered too well. Dolores. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time before opening it. My hands trembled, my breath felt shallow, like I was a teenager again, bracing for something cruel. Inside, a single sheet of paper. No apology, no acknowledgement of the past, just 7 clipped words. Your father is dying. You should come. It felt less like an invitation and more like a command, as if, after all these years, she still believed she held power over me. I didn't plan to go. I told myself I owed them nothing, that my absence was my boundary, my justice. But Elise, she looked at me with those soft, gray eyes, so much like George's, and said gently, "Maybe you need to go. Not for them, for you." I hated how right she was. So a week later, I found myself driving back toward Fort Collins. The roads had changed, but the land hadn't. The trees were taller, the buildings newer, but the shadows still lingered in the corners of my memory. When I pulled up to the old house, it looked exactly as I remembered: chipped paint, drooping gutters, and a porch that still sagged on the left side. Dolores answered the door in her robe, her hair thinner, Her face a map of deep lines, but her eyes were just as sharp. "You came," she said, not a greeting, a statement. "I didn't come for you." I replied. She stepped aside, and I walked into the house where I had been broken. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and silence. The furniture hadn't changed. The same threadbare rug in the living room. The same photos on the mantel, except none of me, as if I had been erased. Walter lay in the back bedroom, hooked to oxygen, eyes sunken, skin pale like wax. He didn't speak when I entered, just turned his head slightly, blinking at me with something unreadable. I stood there for a long time, waiting to feel something. Anger, closure, sadness. But there was nothing. He looked so small, so powerless. The man who once loomed like a monster over my life now couldn't even lift his hand. Dolores sat in a chair by the bed, arms folded. "He's been asking for you," she said. I didn't respond. I turned to Walter, met his gaze, and said softly, "You don't get to ask for anything from me." His eyes welled. Whether it was from guilt or weakness or regret, I didn't care. It was too late, far too late. I left the room. Dolores followed me into the hallway. "You think you're better than us now." I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in over 40 years, and realized something I'd never admitted to myself before. She had always been afraid, not of him, of the world, of change, of love, somewhere along the way. She had chosen control over kindness, cruelty over vulnerability, and she never looked back. I straightened my coat and said, "I don't think I'm better. I know I survived what you didn't have the courage to stop." She didn't respond. She didn't have to. The silence said everything. I walked out of that house with my spine straighter than it had ever been. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I didn't even look back. Some doors don't need to be slammed shut. They just need to be left behind. Coming back to Boulder after that visit felt like breathing real air again. The moment I pulled into my driveway, Penny barked at the gate like I'd been gone a year. Elise came out to meet me, wrapped me in a hug, and didn't ask a single question. She didn't need to. She looked into my eyes and knew something had shifted. I had walked into the fire and I came out whole. For the first time, I allowed myself to unpack the weight I had carried for more than 60 years, the guilt, the doubt, the questions that had haunted me since childhood. Did I deserve it? Was I ever truly loved? Why did she smile, but none of it mattered anymore? Because I had lived, I had broken the cycle. I had raised a daughter with laughter, with affection, with boundaries built on love, not fear. And every hug she gave me, every "I love you, Mom," was proof that I had rewritten the story, not just for me, but for her. That winter, I did something I never thought I'd do. I started writing a book, not for publication, not for anyone else, just for me. I wrote it longhand at first, sitting in my garden shed with a blanket over my lap and hot tea at my side. I wrote about the cellar, about Miss Hughes, about the cold kitchen tiles and the girl who knelt on rice and prayed for someone to see her. I wrote about George, about the way he steadied my shaking hands without ever asking why they shook, about the way he gave me space without ever making me feel alone. And I wrote about Elise, about how her very existence taught me that love didn't have to be earned through silence or obedience. It could simply be given and received. The writing was slow at first, but it became a ritual, a kind of personal church. Sometimes, Elise would peek in while I scribbled. "Are you writing the hard parts?" she'd ask gently. I always smiled. All of them, even the ones I didn't know, still hurt. A few months later, Elise brought home a man named Daniel Quiet, respectful, kind. I watched the way he held the door for her, how he looked her in the eyes when she spoke, and I felt something inside me sigh with relief. She had chosen well. And I had taught her how, when they got engaged, she asked if I would walk her down the aisle. "I don't want anyone else," she said. "It's always been you." That spring, under a grove of cottonwoods not far from our home, I walked with her down the aisle, step by steady step. And for once, the past didn't haunt me. It stood behind me where it belonged. After the wedding, a woman approached me, maybe in her 50s, with tired eyes and a tight voice. She said she'd heard I volunteered at the shelter and asked if I could talk to her sister, who was still with a man like that. I nodded, touched her hand, and said, "Whenever she's ready, I'll be here." Because now, I wasn't just a survivor. I was a lighthouse. Some people think that when you survive something terrible, there comes a day when it all disappears, that the pain leaves, the memories vanish, the past fades like mist. But that's not true. Healing isn't forgetting. It's learning to live alongside what once tried to destroy you and choosing every day not to let it win. I'm 81 years old now. My back aches when I bend too long in the garden. My hands are slower when I write. But my heart is the strongest it's ever been. It took me most of a lifetime to understand this. You don't have to come from love to be capable of giving it. You don't have to be raised by good people to become one. You don't have to carry the pain forever just because someone else handed it to you. For decades, I believed I was broken. I thought that because my father beat me and my mother watched without mercy, I would never know peace, that I was destined to pass on the pain I had inherited, that I was doomed to either repeat their cruelty or disappear under the weight of it. But I was wrong. I didn't become them. I became someone else, someone who listened, who loved, who raised a child with gentleness, who built a life out of nothing but ashes and will. And you can, too. If you are listening to my story right now and something inside you aches, maybe because you've lived through something similar, maybe because someone was supposed to love you but didn't, I want you to hear this with your whole heart. You are not what they did to you. You are not weak for remembering. You are not broken because you still cry. You are not unworthy of love, safety, and peace. You are here. You are still breathing, and that means your story isn't over. I used to think that surviving was the best I could do. Now I know better. Thriving, that's the true revenge. Living with joy, with dignity, with purpose. For me, that purpose became helping others. Young women who walked into the shelter with eyes just like mine used to be scared, silent, bracing for another blow. I've spent the last 20 years sitting beside them, holding their hands, telling them the one thing no one ever told me: you are not alone, and you can leave. I didn't tell my story for pity. I told it for connection, for the ones still stuck in quiet houses filled with loud silence, for the children who flinch when the door creaks, for the grown women who carry shame that was never theirs to begin with. I am living proof that healing is real, that peace is possible, that freedom is worth the fight. So if you've made it to the end of my story, thank you for listening, for feeling, for being here. And if it stirred something inside you, grief, hope, courage, I want you to do something brave. Share your story. Speak out, reach for help, or reach back to help someone else. You never know whose life your voice might save. And if you believe in the power of these true stories of survival, of healing, of women who rise after being torn down, please leave a comment below. Tell us what part of this journey touched you most. Tell us you're here. Tell us you're healing, too. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel for more stories like Mind Stories that remind us we are never truly alone, no matter how dark our past may seem, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is survive, and then tell someone how you did it. Thank you.